As Jesus taught, he said, "Beware of the scribes who like to walk around in long robes and be greeted with respect in the marketplace, and they have the best seats in the synagogues and places of honor at banquets. They devour widows' houses, and for the sake of appearance they say long prayers. They will receive the greater condemnation." He sat down opposite the treasury and watched the crowd putting money into the treasury. Many rich people put in large sums. A poor widow came and put in 2 small copper coins, which are worth a penny. Then he called his disciples and said to them, "Truly I tell you, this poor widow has put in more than all those who are contributing to the treasury. For all of them have contributed out of their abundance, but she out of her poverty has put in everything she had, all she had to live on." The word of God for the people of God. Please be seated. Grace and peace to the disciples of Jesus. Our text speaks about the woman giving sacrificially. I can't say whether Bill Gates or Warren Buffett are giving sacrificially. It was quite a sight a few years back to see 168 billionaires, yes, that's with a B, worldwide line up with Bill Gates, the richest man in the world, and Warren Buffett, the second richest man in the world, to announce that they would give away at least half of their wealth by the time they died to help fund a wide variety of worthwhile causes. I'm still writing those guys because I think with all that money, this $500,000 that we need for that gym, that's pocket change for them. Why don't they send it to me? One day, Jesus saw a group of wealthy men lining up to give a portion of their wealth at the temple. They were making a big show of presenting their offerings. They wanted people to be aware of their charity. They used large coins so that when the pieces hit the money, and it was clanging and made a loud sound, so everyone would know that they were giving a lot of money for the treasury. This is in great contrast to the certain widow that Jesus observed quietly bringing in her gift to present to God. This poor widow had only 2 tiny coins to her name. The widow's mite, an offering with the value of about a penny. That is all she could possibly offer God. Probably no one else in the crowd even noticed her giving, her offering, but Jesus did. Excuse me. Jesus noticed her. He called together his disciples and said to them, "That widow put more money in the treasury than anybody else, because they shared out of their abundance, but she gave all that she had." According to Jesus, her gift was more significant than Bill Gates or Warren Buffett's billions, because God measures your giving by what you give from your heart. Jesus was always thrilled to see authentic faith being lived out. Is there any question this poor widow loved God? She put her money where her heart was. She gave all she had, and Jesus praised her. Now I want to look very carefully at the actions of this widow this morning. I believe some other things might be significant here. Some elements we might normally have overlooked that went to make up her devotion to God to win Jesus' praise. I want to suggest, first of all, that her act of devotion was an indication that she had forgiven God. This lady was a widow. She had lost her husband. Some of you have experienced that event, and you are wise enough to know not only of the hurt and loneliness that may bring, but also of the temptation to bitterness and anger. Most of us are familiar with the sensitive work of a psychiatrist named Elizabeth Kubler-Ross, a pioneer in near-death studies who herself died just a few years back. In 1969, in her book, she identified the 5 stages of grief, which Dr. Kubler-Ross described as denial, anger, bargaining, depression, and acceptance. They provide a framework that helps us go on living after we lose someone we love. Some people handle these stages quite easily. Others sometimes become bogged down in one of these stages of grief, and they never really seem to come out on the other side. We don't have time to deal, obviously, with all of these steps, but consider for a moment that step, anger. It is not unusual for a person who has loved someone very dearly to be angry with that person who just died. How could you leave me, they might say to them in this situation. They cry out to this person who is no longer capable, obviously, of hearing them. It is also not unusual for that person to be angry at themselves, playing that mind game with themselves. If only I would have done this, or if I would have done that, maybe I could have prevented this. There's someone in the room today who has been there. And finally, it's not unusual in that situation to be angry with God. God, why did you take this person from me? If God could do anything, why did He spare my loved one? It's a common response I hear. None of us can deal very well with the idea of losing someone we love. Even though we know God has prepared a place for our loved one with Him that is far more perfect than our existence here, it is still difficult to let go. When that event occurs, it takes time for us to heal. It takes time for us to get back to that place to where we once were. And one of the obstacles to healing may be our resentment toward God. The first thing that this widow may have been saying as she dropped her coins into the temple treasury is, I've come to grips with my grief. I'm over my resentment. I am at peace with God. There's a second thing that widow may have been saying as she dropped in those 2 coins. It is this, I trust God. You see, there was no Social Security, no pension, no monthly check she would be receiving now that her husband was gone. Widows were quite vulnerable. Unless her husband was a wealthy man, or unless she had children to support her, or perhaps other family members that would take her in, she was at the mercy of a sometimes heartless society. Jesus indicated her poverty when He said that those 2 coins were all that she had. If indeed she did give all that she had, she must have done it trusting that God would provide for her with her daily bread. That's a tremendous amount of trust. That kind of trust, that kind of confidence, that kind of hope is pleasing to God. The late United Methodist Bishop Charles Golden told of visiting a mission school in India where the students were sang an African-American spiritual. They sang it as a courtesy to him because he was a black man. They sang, I got shoes. Now Bishop Garden said he suddenly realized these children who sang this old spiritual about having shoes were all barefooted. It reminded him that when his people had composed and sung this song, they too were barefooted. They were singing a song of hope and trust, for they knew there were shoes laid up in heaven for them. You may know how it goes. I got shoes, you got shoes, all God's children's got shoes. When I get to heaven, I'm going to put on my shoes and walk all over God's heaven. I may be barefoot right now. This may be the last 2 coins I'm dropping in the temple treasury. But God will provide. This may have been the widow's way of saying, I know, God, you will provide for me. This widow had forgiven God and she trusted God. Can I say to each of us, do we trust God as much as this widow did? I know we have people that do. And here's the final thing her offering may have said that day. She believed in the work of God. The work of the temple was important to her, and she wanted to support it. She wanted to put God first in her life. Doug Sherman and William Hendricks tell about a man of their acquaintance who owned an especially lucrative business. Several years ago, he and his wife went to a strategic planner to help them chart their course for the rest of their lives. For the better part of the morning, the consultant listened as they went through their lives and what was important to them and what their aspirations were for the future. Finally, the consultant took out a piece of blank paper and drew a small box at the top of it. Out on the side, he wrote 2 words, Jesus and money. Then he looked at the couple and said, from what you've told me this morning, there are two major forces in your life up to now. But as I see it, you're at a point where one of those are going to have priority. Now you tell me which one of these words to put in the box, and I'll map out the strategy for you. If you want Jesus in the box, fine. I'll show you how to fulfill that for your life. And if you want money first in the box, I'll show you the plan for that. According to my friend, the room was quiet for about 3 or 4 minutes. The couple didn't say a word to each other, but they didn't need to. They realized that they had come to a fork in the road where they were going to have to decide which agenda mattered. The financial interest of the business or their commitment to Christ. We are told that the couple chose to put Jesus in the box. By their own testimony, it made a most profound difference in the course of their lives ever since. Which one would you or I put in that box? Which is your or my greater priority, money or Jesus? This widow spent her last 2 coins on the work of God rather than on herself. The work of God was important in her life. Robert Schnace wrote a book. You'll find that most seminarians read this book. It's the 5 Practices of Fruitful Congregations. Let me read just a few lines to you from this book. Every sanctuary and chapel in which we have worship, every church organ that has lifted our spirits, every pew that we have worshiped in, every communion rail where we have knelt, every hymnal in which we have sung, every praise band and every choir has touched our hearts. Every church classroom where we have gathered with our friends, every church kitchen that has prepared our meals, every church van that has taken us to camp, every cabin that we have slept in, all are the fruit of someone's extreme generosity. We have been the recipients of grace upon grace. We are the heirs, the beneficiaries of those who have come before us, who were touched by the generosity of Jesus enough to give graciously so that we could experience the truth of Christ for ourselves. We owe the same to generations to come. Doubtless it was with pleasure that this widow dropped in her coins, for she knew she was part of something bigger than herself. That is true whether we are giving to God or whether we are helping some of God's children. A certain woman lost her husband, and she was having difficulty moving through the stages of grief. For weeks, she went each day to the cemetery and put flowers on the grave. She simply could not let go. No matter what she did, it seemed that her grief would not dissipate. It seemed to get worse. In her despair, she went to see her doctor for a checkup. When she told him about taking flowers each day to the cemetery, her doctor made a gentle suggestion. He said, instead of taking flowers to the cemetery, let me suggest that you make a trip to the hospital. I have 2 patients who are alone. They have no family in this city, and they would really enjoy receiving some fresh flowers. Why not take those fresh flowers for one day to the hospital rather than to the cemetery? Ask them about their progress and give them some words of encouragement. See if there is anything you can do for them. The lady took the doctor's suggestion. She took the flowers to the hospital rather than to the cemetery. Soon she was able to work through her grief. Those coins dropped in the temple treasury that day may have been an important part of the widow's recovery from her grief experience. By dropping in those coins, she realized she was part of something bigger than herself. She was participating in God's work on earth. No wonder Jesus was pleased to see her make her offering. No wonder he praised her to his disciples. She had been victorious over her grief. She trusted God for her daily bread, and she was involved in the ongoing work of the kingdom. In fact, in God's eyes, he put this widow's giving right up there with Bill Gates and Warren Buffett.